Aboard the Xelari warship Zephyrion, the dim blue glow of control panels cast elongated shadows across the metallic walls. The air, thick with sterilized precision, carried none of the warmth humans associated with life. General Var'ash stood at the viewing deck, arms crossed behind his back, as the latest batch of prisoners was escorted into containment. The human war had dragged on longer than anticipated, and he had little patience left for inefficiency. He turned, his reptilian gaze sweeping over the captives. They were smaller than expected, too small. A frown creased the ridges of his forehead. The adult prisoners, though bruised and exhausted, carried themselves with quiet defiance, their postures tense with contained fury. But the ones at their center, Var'ash's gaze narrowed. They were children. This was not a strategic miscalculation. The retrieval squads were precise, disciplined. No civilian was ever taken unless there was value in their capture. And yet, here they were, a cluster of wide-eyed, fragile creatures, their limbs thin and untrained, their expressions shifting between fear and quiet determination. A Xelari officer approached and saluted sharply. "These are found among the human resistance, General." The adults shielded them, refused to leave them behind. Var'ash's clawed fingers tapped against his armor. "Why?" The officer hesitated. "They called them innocents, sir." Var'ash's species did not bear offspring in the biological sense. They were cultivated, engineered for strength and purpose. The concept of innocence was foreign to him. A being was either useful or was not. His gaze locked onto the eldest of the group, a human female, likely no older than 14. She stood protectively in front of the others, arms spread as though to shield them from unseen threats. Her chin was raised, eyes unyielding despite the tremor in her stance. She reminded him of human soldiers he had faced before, fragile in body, yet inexplicably resilient in spirit. "What is your name?" he asked, voice devoid of emotion. The girl did not answer. Var'ash stepped closer. The other children shrank back, but she remained rooted, her fingers curling into fists. He admired defiance in warriors, but in a creature so small, so obviously incapable of combat, it was perplexing. "You misunderstand your situation," he continued. "I did not repeat my questions." Still, she said nothing. Instead, one of the younger ones, a boy, perhaps no older than 8, stepped forward. His voice was small but steady. "She doesn't have to talk to you." Murmurs spread among the Xelari officers. Var'ash's species did not tolerate insubordination, least of all from captives. And yet, instead of recoiling from inevitable punishment, the boy reached for the girl's hand, his small fingers gripping hers tightly. Something stirred in Var'ash's chest, something unfamiliar. He studied the boy. No genetic modifications, no enhanced musculature, no armor. Just a child, armed with nothing but defiance. Var'ash turned to his officer. "Separate them. Keep them alive. I want to know why humans consider them so valuable." A pair of guards moved forward. The children cried out as they were pulled apart. The girl thrashed, teeth bared like a cornered predator. "Don't touch them," she snarled. Her voice echoed through the chamber, and for a brief moment, the entire warship seemed to still. The raw emotion in her tone, anger, fear, something else, was unlike anything Var'ash had ever witnessed. There was no logic in it. She was outnumbered, powerless, and yet she fought. She did not fight for herself. She fought for them. The Xelari were conditioned to prioritize their own survival above all else. They obeyed orders, worked in unison, but attachment? That was a weakness. And yet, this girl, this human child, stood against an entire warship of warriors for the sake of others. Var'ash exhaled slowly, watching as the guards dragged the captives toward containment cells. The girl continued to struggle until exhaustion forced her still, her breaths ragged, her glare unwavering. "Intriguing," he muttered. Later, within the research chamber, the Xelari scientists prepared their instruments. The mind probes were ready, designed to extract information from prisoners through non-invasive psychic pulses. It was a method perfected over centuries, one that never failed. The girl was strapped to the analysis chair, wristbound. A scientist activated the probe. A pulse of energy crackled through the air, latching onto her consciousness. Var'ash expected resistance, perhaps mild discomfort, a brief delay before the probe unraveled her mind. Instead, alarms blared. The scientist stumbled back. "Something is wrong," he reported. "The probe, she is resisting." Impossible. No untrained mind could resist the device. Var'ash approached, his gaze shifting to the girl. Sweat lined her forehead. Her jaw was clenched, fingers curled into fists. But her eyes, they burned with something primal, something the Xelari had no word for. The scientist adjusted the settings. The probe pushed deeper. The girl gasped, but then something changed. The chamber's temperature seemed to drop. The air thickened. The Xelari in the room stiffened, their breathing shallow. An emotion, not their own, pressed against them, raw and unrelenting. "You will not take me." The girl's voice did not echo through the chamber. It echoed in their minds. The probe's feedback loop shattered. Sparks flew as the device malfunctioned, its energy spiraling out of control. The scientist staggered away, eyes wide with something dangerously close to fear. Var'ash watched, fascinated. Humans were physically weaker. They lacked the regenerative abilities of other species, the advanced intelligence of the Xelari, the strategic precision of the Xelari. And yet, here was a child, holding her ground against technology designed to subjugate minds. He turned to his officers. "And the procedure." The scientist hesitated. "Sir," Var'ash's voice was sharper this time. "I said end it." The device powered down. The girl slumped in her restraints, chest rising and falling in labored breaths. Her defiance had drained her, but it had not broken her. Var'ash regarded her in silence. There was no logical reason for what he was about to do, but logic no longer seemed to hold dominion over this moment. He turned away. "Do not harm them." His officers exchanged glances, confused but obedient. As Var'ash left the chamber, the girl's voice followed him, not aloud, but within his own mind. "Monster." He did not respond. For the first time in his existence, he was uncertain if she was wrong. Var'ash had never known doubt. The Xelari did not waver, did not question, did not hesitate. Yet, as he stood before the reinforced containment chamber, staring through the transparent barrier at the human children huddled together, doubt gnawed at him like an unseen parasite. They should have been insignificant, tactical miscalculations, weak, irrelevant organisms with no purpose in war. And yet, their presence had unsettled something deep within him, something unspoken that no Xelari conditioning had ever prepared him to confront. Inside, the eldest, the girl, sat with her back against the cold metallic wall, her arms wrapped around the smaller ones. She had not broken, not even after the mind probe had failed against her resistance. Instead, she had become their shield, their silent protector. She met his gaze through the glass, unafraid. "Why do you fight for them?" His voice was calm, measured, yet edged with something close to curiosity. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she answered, her voice hoarse but unyielding. "Because they are mine to protect." There was no logic in it. Protecting the weak was inefficient, a liability. And yet, the conviction in her voice was absolute, unwavering. Var'ash turned away and strode down the corridor, his thoughts tangled in contradictions. His orders had been clear: study the children, extract their usefulness, and if they provided none, discard them. He had never questioned such command before. But now, the very idea sent a strange, unwelcome sensation curling through his gut. Inside the warship's strategy chamber, the holographic presence of High Command flickered to life before him. The looming figures of the Xelari hierarchy regarded him with the cold scrutiny of predators assessing a wounded asset. "You are late with your report, General Var'ash," one of them intoned. "The human prisoners have proven unusual," he admitted. A ripple of displeasure passed through the council. "They are weak. They are disposable." Another voice cut in, emotionless. "If they cannot be used, they serve no purpose." Var'ash's claws curled at his sides. "They resist in ways we do not yet understand." A curiosity at best, the council leader stated. Continue the experiments. If no results are obtained, eliminate them. Var'ash hesitated. A moment too long. You are hesitating, the voice observed, a glacial edge creeping into its tone. No, he replied smoothly, forcing himself back into the mask of obedience. I will do what must be done. The transmission ended. The chamber fell silent. Var'ash exhaled slowly. He had lied to High Command. He had never done that before. Something was changing within him, a shift both unfamiliar and dangerous. That night, he returned to the containment chamber, dismissing the guards with a single command. The children remained as they were, curled against one another like a pack of fragile creatures warding off the cold. The girl lifted her head. Come to gawk at the weak again? No, he said simply. He entered the chamber. The younger ones shrank away, but she remained where she was, watching him with wary defiance. Your people, he said carefully, they protect their young at all costs. Her expression hardened. Yes, even when it is illogical. She tilted her chin, especially then. Var'ash studied her for a long moment. The Xelari do not protect the weak. I know, she said. That's why you'll lose. The words struck him with more force than they should have. Lose? The Xelari were superior in strength, technology, numbers. They had crushed countless civilizations before humanity. How could a species so fragile believe itself victorious? And yet, the conviction in her voice was the same steel he had seen in dying human soldiers who refused to surrender. For the first time in his existence, he entertained a thought that should have been impossible. What if strength was not what the Xelari had always believed it to be? A quiet noise interrupted his thoughts. The youngest child, Ben, the small one, had approached without fear. He was holding something, a tiny, crudely made object, a carved figure. Ben hesitated before extending it to him. Here, Var'ash stared. It was a poor representation of anything Xelari craftsmanship would consider worthy, but there was something undeniably deliberate about it. Something personal. You made this? He asked. Ben nodded. It's for you. Var'ash did not take it. Why? Ben frowned slightly, as though the question confused him. Because you looked sad? Var'ash felt his entire worldview tilt on its axis. He had slaughtered humans. He had ordered their destruction. He had been their captor, their enemy, the executioner of their people. And yet, this child, this insignificant, powerless child, saw sadness in him. And instead of fearing him, he offered a gift. Var'ash took the small figure carefully between his claws. It was the first thing he had ever been given, not as a tool, not as an order, but as an offering of something else. Something he had no name for. And in that moment, he made his decision. The Xelari would kill the children, unless he stopped them. The thought should have been absurd. Betraying his own kind was unthinkable, a crime punishable by death. But as he looked at the fragile creatures before him, their defiance, their fear, their unwavering ability to care for one another even in the face of annihilation, he knew he could not stand by and watch them be erased. That night, he accessed the warship's restricted channels, his fingers flying over the console as he bypassed the security locks. His own species had made him a warrior, but they had also made him their tactician. A human resistance frequency flickered on his screen. Static crackled before a voice cut through. This is Captain Dorn of the Human Coalition. Identify yourself. Var'ash took a breath. I am General Var'ash of the Xelari Dominion, he said, his voice steady. I have your young, and I am prepared to return them. A long silence. Then the voice sharpened. What's the catch? I need an extraction, he admitted. And I need it now. A second of hesitation, then, if this is a trick, it is not. Another pause. Then, finally, coordinates? Var'ash exhaled slowly, his claws tightening over the carved figure still in his palm. There was no turning back now. Sending them now. The warship's alarms wailed through the corridors, their shrill urgency rattling against the cold metal walls. Red emergency lights pulsed like a heartbeat, illuminating the path Var'ash took as he moved with measured precision, the human children trailing behind him. His grip tightened around the weapon at his side, not for use against the humans, but against his own kind. The decision to betray the Xelari Dominion had been made in a moment, but the consequences had already begun unfolding with calculated inevitability. High Command had noticed the unauthorized transmission. Security forces had been mobilized. Escape was no longer a possibility. It was a necessity. The girl, Xelari, matched his pace, her wary eyes scanning the corridors with the sharp awareness of someone who had spent too much time in war. The younger children clung to one another, their hands locked tightly, a chain of fragile lives he had now bound himself to protect. The docking bay was still under restricted lockdown, but Var'ash had already anticipated this. His claws danced over the access panel, overriding the ship's protocols. The massive steel doors groaned as they began to part, revealing the vast abyss of space beyond the force field. A single ship waited for them in the distance, barely visible against the star-strewn void. The humans had answered his call, but so had the Xelari. Footsteps thundered from behind, a squad of armored soldiers emerging from the corridor, their weapons raised, their visors reflecting cold efficiency. Their leader, Commander Xelari, took a single step forward. "Var'ash," he said, voice sharp as broken steel. "What have you done?" Var'ash did not answer. The children huddled closer behind him. Xelari's eyes flicked toward them, then back to Var'ash. "This is treason." Var'ash exhaled. "No," he said. "This is choice." Xelari's jaw tightened. The Xelari did not choose. They obeyed. They followed the path set before them, unquestioning, unwavering. But here was Var'ash, the most disciplined of them, standing as a shield before human children. "The Dominion will not forgive this," Xelari warned. "I know," Var'ash said simply. For a moment, neither moved. Then Xelari raised his weapon. Var'ash reacted without thought. His own rifle snapped up, energy discharging in a blinding arc. Xelari reflexes were swift, near instantaneous, but Var'ash had fought beside them long enough to anticipate every motion, every hesitation, every fraction of a second between intent and action. He was faster. Xelari staggered as the blast struck his shoulder, sending him crashing against the wall. The other soldiers hesitated just long enough. "Run," Var'ash ordered. Xelari didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed Ben's hand, pulling the others forward. They raced toward the loading ramp of the human ship, its engines already roaring to life. More Xelari stormed into the hangar. Var'ash turned, his stance shifting into pure defense, firing calculated shots to drive them back. But they would not stop. They would never stop. The children were nearly aboard when Ben's foot caught on a metal grating. He stumbled, crashing onto the floor with a sharp cry. Var'ash saw it before anyone else. The Xelari sniper positioned on the upper deck, his weapon locked onto the fallen boy. Instinct overrode reason. Var'ash moved. The shot fired. Pain tore through him, searing hot and blinding. The force of the impact staggered him, his vision tilting, the scent of burned flesh filling his senses. But Ben was untouched. Var'ash had made sure of that. He fell to one knee, breath ragged. The ship's engine screamed as it began to lift off. "Var'ash," Xelari's voice, distant, desperate. He forced himself to his feet, every movement agony, his gaze locking onto the children now safe within the ship. For the first time in his existence, he did not belong. The Xelari had marked him as a traitor. The humans would never trust him. And yet, as the ship's ramp closed, as the vessel shot forward, carrying its fragile cargo away from this place, Var'ash felt something settle within him. It was not victory. It was not peace. But it was enough.